Well, today we're going to start a new painting. What I have done is coated the surface of the canvas. If you could see the surface very closely, you would see that this is a linen canvas. It's really actually a very nice Belgian linen. I coated this particular canvas with a mixture of titanium white and English light red, creating this sort of pinkish tone. And the reason I did that, I had something in mind, which is I wanted to paint a twilight setting. In other words, an evening, early evening, kind of that misty feel of you know, it's a cool evening and the light has really begun to fade, and yet maybe the top of the sky there's still a little bit of light there and a few delicate clouds. And I felt the undertone of this rust-colored, sort of pinky rust-colored tone will provide a nice vibration as I work the subtler shades of the blues of the evening sky into that surface. So I have a rough idea of where I want to go with my painting, and I want to be able to take some ideas I've had of, you know, a sense of a cottage that is perhaps kind of hidden along this stream, and twilight is filling the sky. The title of the painting is tentatively called Twilight Cottage. Now I've gotten to that point where I can start to see my composition, and I know it doesn't look like much at this point, but I can kind of read my own shorthand, if you will, and sort of like a doctor whose handwriting no one else can read except maybe the pharmacist. And it is sort of a chance for me to stage the painting. And whenever I talk to artists, I oftentimes use that phrase, that I stage each painting. By that I mean I view it kind of like the set of a movie or a theater play, in that I want to take the viewer into that world through certain carefully placed cues or keys that will kind of set this drama of this little story I want to tell. Now in this case we have a large gable here of our cottage. This is a cottage set along this river. So I've sketched in the river, and you're going to be able to see into the distance here on this side of the canvas. This will be the distant area, and the river will come along the front of the cottage. Again, very misty, twilight kind of feel to it. I've even indicated a moon up here. I'm going to put a little delicate sliver of a moon. At least that's my current plan. That is subject to change depending on how it ends up looking. But at this point I can see into the composition. I've staged it. I'm aware of how I'm going to light it. I'm aware of what delicate little details I'm going to add. And then what I'm going to do is allow this staging, this sketching portion to completely dry, and following that I will have a permanent drawing beneath which I can add other layers. And then as I add those layers I can always refer back to this early drawing. But it's important to get your composition staged quickly so that you can see where you're going to go. I like to think of it even as a road map that'll kind of tell me where I'm going to go from here. Well, as you can see, I've begun some of my color lay-in. Now, of course, what remains of my initial work is all this area that we see down here in the lower part. And this is sort of the halfway point of covering up the surface. I began by putting tones into the sky. I wanted to get that soft, subtle, bluish aqua tone, at least for now, as a staging point, I might say, of what I want to do next, some colors I want to add in next. And I felt as though the aqua was nice because it kind of allowed a nice vibration to this rusty pink kind of color down here. Once I've gotten the details to where I really feel comfortable with them, then I soften them with this brush. This is my fan blender, and it's basically a bristle brush that has been flattened so that the hairs spread out and form a nice fan. I call this process sweeping up, and after I lay in a surface of paint, I like to sweep up a little so that the colors blend and it doesn't look like paint. In other words, I like to create a painting that the paint doesn't just shout at you. I want the paint to look like paint, but have it be subtle, so that it looks like a cottage, or it looks like a waterfall, or a sky, or whatever it is you're painting. I like the illusion of reality to be there, but it still needs to look a little bit painterly as well. So let's continue putting brushwork in this case, small brushwork. I'm not going to go too overboard. After I've covered the canvas completely, then I'll go through the next phase, which is really coming back and drawing again on the surface of the canvas other details that I might want to add. In this case, I would like to put a grove of aspen trees off over here, and I would like to have you know, some interesting detail in my stream down here. But initially, let's just try to block in the scene as it is, and we'll add extra detail later. Well, with the painting completely dry now, I'm having a lot of fun with my little piece of charcoal. I have a square charcoal that I like to use for this phase, and I'm beginning to rethink the entire composition. What's fun for me is that phase where you're not entirely sure where you're going with the painting. It just sort of unfolds itself. As I work, I am thinking about positioning a spatial relationship on this painting so that I have a substantial sense of the presence of this little cottage. But there is also a sense of movement and tranquility. Now, this is called Twilight Cottage. And so as I've sketched, I've been thinking, what are the romantic kind of things that we would associate with twilight, you know, early evening. Maybe you would be sitting outside hearing the crickets, hearing the frogs. And to me, one of the things about twilight I love is being somewhere where you can hear a murmuring brook. So, of course, I wanted to put the brook, the little stream in going beside our cottage. But how will you hear that brook if you're inside? So I've invented a little ledge-like stone terrace. And granted, we can't see it too well in charcoal, but this will be a little retaining wall of stone that will provide a little terrace to sit on. And of course, I'll have some summer evening sort of lights that will be out there on our terrace. I also came up with the motif of a bridge. I wanted to have a sense that we could travel from the right-hand side of our canvas over to the left-hand side. I sketched in the moon, the shape of a moon. This will be the first time that I've painted a sliver moon, and so of course I have it suggested up there. I had to have it angling in that way because we're going to want to bring the eye around the circle of the canvas. Also, I wanted to suggest that there is something off in the distance, that, you know, it's twilight and the shadows are over the landscape, and we're not quite sure what lay beyond that bridge. As we would walk up that stream, what would be up there? So I think I'm going to put a few little lights up there. I'm also going to create a sense of the stars that are very atmospheric. I'm going to cause them to glow with a little bit of extra radiance. And I reconfigured the cottage to give us a frontal chimney just because I wanted to get a sense of smoke coming out, and maybe another side chimney here. That also will turn the surface of my cottage so that you go back in space just a little bit with the cottage. And then finally, this lower right-hand corner of the composition becomes very important. I'm going to put some hollyhocks or foxglove or something, a nice tall plant that is growing wild here, or perhaps has been planted by these people. It again gives the sense of cultivation from side to side. I'll repeat that form here to suggest that whoever lives in this beautiful little setting can come across the bridge and cultivate the garden on either side. Now, I'll blow the excess dust from my canvas, and now we're ready to begin with the detail. Well, I've now reached that point where we're starting to see that mood emerge, and I just love to see the sense of overlapping foliage, the trees that are going into the distance, and overall a softness of mood. Imagine that time of night when the crickets begin to sing their beautiful evening song and the moon is barely visible over the horizon. The first few stars have come out, and you can see the twinkling of a neighbor's house out across the lake. That's the mood of Twilight Cottage. And in fact, as you see the development of the canvas here, you'll see I've kept everything tonal and in relation to that mood of the early evening. So what I'll be doing now is taking a mixture of paint, and you can see what I'm mixing here on my palette is simply some white, a little bit of titanium white mixed with a brownish color and with a greenish color, sap green and burnt sienna in this case. And then I bring it up and I use that to begin to establish some detail. And the nice thing about it, it is opaque because I've mixed in just a little bit of white, and yet it's a rich, full color. I have found that creating a nocturne does not mean eliminating all color. In fact, so often I've seen painters who've painted moonlight scenes and it almost looks like an old black and white movie or something. Everything is gray and dull. And I have taken enough moonlight walks, being the romantic that I am, that I can tell you from experience there is a lot of color if you will simply search for it out in the moonlight. And so what we do is we try to bring that color out. I'm going to put a lot of greens into the foreground to kind of suggest the lushness of this setting along the stream. I originally envisioned it as simply a stream, and now I've begun to suggest back here in the distance a sense of a lake, because I wanted to get a little cabin off in the distance that was reflecting its light in the water. And again, it's just part of that mood. I mean, I just daydream about places like this. You're on a stream, the lake is off behind you, and there's the cabin in the distance. Your neighbor's lights are on. And very romantic idea for the painting. So I wanted to emphasize the lake, and I opened up the area of the lake just a little bit. And it was kind of fun because you always feel like you're sort of reshaping the world as you work on your landscape painting. You have a chance to put an entire lake in with just a few strokes. So it's kind of fun to watch it emerge. Now, my grass that we see in the mid-section of the painting here is going to give way to some rocks down here in the distance. See that color. See, we start out with that grayish undertone, and we begin to put the colors in, very subtle, and we'll build upon that. I'll tell you, I just love moonlight. What a romantic mood it is, and what a romantic time of day it is. We're going to use the painting knife to rework the surface to eliminate little bumps now that I've put in pretty much all the first layer of detail. And what I want to do is kind of roughen the surface a little to accept the final layers of paint. Now, I'm also doing another thing as I'm roughening the surface with my painting knife, which is that I am taking down the little nibs of paint that build up. Now, there is something about my technique, or I think the technique really of any artist, where you put your strokes on, and I have been using extensively my fan blender to soften down those strokes, you know, to soften down the layers of paint. And yet it's still, there's just a little residue sometimes as a stroke lays on the surface that a little ridge builds up. Well, I don't like those ridges by and large. I like to bring them down, because what I find is that as I put a soft hair stroke over those ridges, oftentimes those ridges get in the way and kind of look too accidental. What I'm going to do is lay in a little paint. What I want to do is put some white, titanium white, on the surface, and you can see that long, thin layer of paint. That is because as I take my palette knife and take batches of paint and begin to mix with it, I like to have clean paint going the entire length of my palette so that I can take areas of paint that are clean always, and always pick up new areas of clean paint. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is mix up a kind of a light yellowish green, and I'm taking some of my color, which in this case is called phthalo yellow green. Now, this is a nice color. Begin to work into these layers of paint that I have left a lot of room for bringing new brightness and luminosity into the painting. In fact, as I bring my stroke down, you can see that really I had left the moon and the stars fairly dull up to this point. And again, my luminist painting technique depends upon continuous addition of light and of color over existing layers of paint. I am always setting the stage for the next layer, you know, just having that sense that, you know, everything was just put into place so that you can then come in with those final strokes, and those accents make the whole thing come to life and glow. I've mixed up some luminous pinkish tone that is going to be kind of neat, because what I'm doing is I'm putting those final strokes that I call the strokes of light. And I sometimes call this turning on the lights. And it is so fun to see these final little touches come together. I have just this ability to watch and just almost sit in the sidelines and watch as the light begins to emerge on the canvas. In this case, I'm working on the area of the waterfalls, and I'm just bringing some of those extra luminous touches into the painting. Those luminous touches are what really are my particular signature, I guess you could call it, on the painting. What sets a painting of mine apart is probably the use of that luminous color. That's what I love to do, and I guess over the years I've developed my own techniques and my own ways of doing it, and people notice that. They write me letters, and they feel that light within the painting. Twilight to me is more than just a time of day. It is a state of mind. I see that moon hovering on the horizon, and in my innermost dreams, I think about and I long for those moments of twilight, when a hush comes over the whole world, and maybe we have a sense that night is encroaching and the daylight is beginning to fade away. We see the little cabin out on the distant lake, and we know that there is a human presence here, that nature in all its beauty is enfolding the landscape with the light of twilight. And yet, people are busy in their homes, preparing for the evening. I love painting the little bridge with the lights on it. Those are gas lights that kind of date back to an earlier era that suggest a walkway that is the kind of walkway we might take to the sound of crickets as twilight enfolds us. Of course, beneath the bridge, we see the little stream coming down to a pool where the water is gathered. Of course, we know the water is so pure that you could walk down with your pail and bring home water to use in the evening and to have for your water to cook with. And that was sort of my idea. It's a twilight setting in which nature and human beings are at one, where we see the beauty of nature in the form of stars that are emerging in the evening. And yet we also see the warmth and coziness of a cottage where people are at rest, retiring, preparing for the evening. I do feel as though God has allowed me to be part of this process of creating these paintings, that somehow when the painting's finished, there's something in it that people respond to. And I don't even know where it comes from most of the time. It clearly is something God put in there that people notice, and obviously he was the one who put it there. And that's what the Painter of Light style is, to me, is all about. It's just a way of touching people's lives with a little beauty, a little joy, and a little light.